Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 61 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Dallas Stars, in which the Sharks have lost 7-6 in overtime. It was just 3 days ago where the Sharks had their first matchup against the Stars this season. In that one, it was a game in which Dallas never actually held a lead, and yet came back from two separate one-goal deficits to force an overtime and eventually to win in shootout, leaving the Sharks with just a singular point. Here tonight, it is more of the same between these two teams, as again, the Stars did not ever actually hold a lead here tonight. Instead, they came back from multiple deficits in this one to force the overtime, and this time they would win in overtime, not even needing the shootout, leaving the Sharks with just 1 point. However, this game and how it actually played out was quite different from the one a few days ago. Let us start off in the first period, and within just the first few minutes, the Sharks would get a power play and score with a goal from Anthony Duclair, as he would continue his hot streak, not just with this one, but with a 4-point night from him to make it 1-0 San Jose quite early on. A few minutes more would go by before the Sharks would get their second of the game, coming from Fabian Zetterlund, to make it 2-0 San Jose. At this point, the Sharks were getting relatively heavily outshot by the Dallas Stars, but notably, if you were to actually take a closer look at how these shots were coming to be, the Stars were shooting a lot from the perimeter. There really weren't that many dangerous opportunities on net for Dallas. The only couple of scares were more so just mistakes being made by the Sharks goaltender Kaapo Kähkönen, which was perhaps a bad omen of things to come later on in this game, as he fumbled the puck and had to kind of find it between his legs a couple of times. But besides that, there weren't necessarily a ton of high danger chances for Dallas. That is, until the last couple of minutes of the first period, when the Sharks would get into a bit of penalty trouble. And as we know, the Sharks are not able to rely particularly heavily on their penalty kill for the entirety of this season, or at least almost the entirety of this season, and it once again comes back to bite them here, as the lead is cut in half with a goal from Jamie Benn, and then tied with a goal from Stankoven just about 20 to 30 seconds later on a completely different power play, and so it is a 2-2 game at the end of the first period. In the second, the Sharks would once again take the lead back. This one would come from Ryan Carpenter to make it 3-2 San Jose, and then it would be the Dallas Stars once again, there's a theme here, tying it up, this time at 3 with a goal from Wyatt Johnston. The Sharks, though, were not done with scoring in the second period, as they got not one but two more to get their lead to now a more solid 2-goal lead. And that would be the final score at the end of the second period. Notably, in that second period, this time it was actually San Jose who were out shooting the Dallas Stars, leaving them with not very many chances on net. It seemed as though, with a 5-3 lead going into a third period in a game that the Sharks have actually played rather well in, you don't necessarily say they were better than Dallas, but up to that point they were quite competitive with them. You would think they would manage to hold this lead and get the victory. And in the early parts of the third period, that seemed to be going that very same direction, as the Sharks would score again the next goal. This one would make it 6-3 San Jose at this point, coming from Mikael Granlund, and thus they carry a 3-goal lead into the last half of the third period. And it felt at this point that the Dallas Stars were just completely down and out, that there really wasn't that much doing for them. This was not a situation where the Stars were piling chance after chance after chance, and you were just hoping that at one point the dam would not actually end up bursting, but instead the Sharks were defending rather well and even getting some okay chances for themselves in the first half of this third period. But once this first goal for Dallas would go in, that did indeed end up opening the floodgates that seemingly didn't have a lot of water behind them at that point, as the Stars made it 6-4, then 6-5, and then tied it at 6, all within 3 minutes of each other. So a game that seemed solidly in Sharks' control suddenly got flipped on its head, and the last half of the third period was entirely Dallas controlled, and the Sharks were even somewhat lucky, so to speak, to escape into the post-regulation time with a singular point. Of course, as I mentioned a couple of games ago, is the fact that technically the worst case scenario for the San Jose Sharks is for them to lose games in overtime, because you don't want to get points in the standings, but at the very least, if you win, you get the happiness of a win. So losing in post-regulation play gets the worst of both worlds. Well, it is made even worse by the fact that the Sharks lose in post-regulation time in a game in which they had a 3-goal lead with less than 10 minutes to go in the third period, as it is Roope Hintz who would score the overtime game winner in a shift that was essentially a 3-on-2 due to Eklund's clearly hurt from having, perhaps I believe, blocked a shot in this situation, could barely skate, could barely move around the ice. The Dallas Stars took very heavy advantage of that to get their game winner, and so with this loss, it's definitely a disappointing one for San Jose. Taking a look at the standings at the very least, the other team that we obviously have been keeping an eye on is the Chicago Blackhawks. They were in action tonight against the Arizona Coyotes, and the Blackhawks did win in regulation, so that moved them up to 37 points. Briefly, the San Jose Sharks stayed in last place, but that only lasted a couple of hours because of this loser point that they would get here tonight against Dallas, and the fact that they still have 2 games in hand on Chicago. Now with them being tied at points, tied at 37, the Sharks have supplanted them once more to hold that 31st spot, but it is at least one step closer to the coveted last place position. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the top line of Duclair, Granlund, and Zetterlund, and it is of course no surprise that this was by far the best line for the San Jose Sharks here tonight, contributing heavily on the score sheet for San Jose. Out of the 6 goals that they managed to score, 4 of them coming from a combination pretty much of these 3 players, and primarily the standout performer was of course Anthony Duclair, who seemed to be all over the ice for the San Jose Sharks throughout the majority of this game, barring the last disastrous 10 minutes of the third period. And it's fantastic to see Duclair finally show up here for San Jose in really the most pivotal moments of the season. Not because the Sharks are in some sort of crazy playoff race where they're hoping to get every single point that matters, but instead, the Sharks are just a few days away from the trade deadline. It is Friday of this week, so just 3 days. The Sharks only have one more game left before that, which is on Thursday against the New York Islanders. And Duclair needs to put up his best possible hockey if the Sharks want to get every possible asset and even just the ability to move him to some random team that is looking for some offensive help on the front end. Duclair's value at the start of the season looked like it might end up being like a first-round pick, but over this last couple of weeks, it was more so looking like he might get a third, perhaps even at worst a fourth-round pick. With this game, that may have actually just moved the Sharks up around in the future draft in terms of draft picks being able to be acquired. I feel as though a third-round pick is more or less guaranteed if the Sharks are able to move him. Of course, if you package it with like some sort of player or a prospect of some sort, then the draft pick, if there is one, would come in a bit lower, but just from a strict player for draft pick trade, a third is good, and this is a big reason why. A 4-point outing for him, clearly the best player on the ice for the San Jose Sharks. Great game. On the other side of things, for the other winger here is Fabian Zetterlund, who was, I would say, a small step behind Duclair, but a fantastic compliment for number 10 here for the San Jose Sharks. He did have a small scare in the third period where he did leave with some sort of injury where he ended up missing a few shifts, but would eventually come back at a point where the Sharks were getting absolutely caved in, so it didn't really make much of a difference. But at least in the time that he was healthy in the first couple of periods, things were doing very, very well for Zetterlund. Nice to see him actually get a strong performance on this top line after what I had said in the previous game, where I was saying he is more so a player suited for the middle six. At least these types of games can happen here and there. When it comes to the third player on this line, interestingly enough, Mikael Granlund I thought was good, but the weakest link, which has been more often than not the case over these last few weeks here on this top line. And I wonder if the trade deadline is playing a small aspect in that. There have been rumors that Mikael Granlund could end up getting traded, but it is going to be very difficult for that to happen. Granlund still is being paid $5 million and most importantly has 1 year left on his deal. He will be under contract next season. And so with the Sharks only having one retention slot, and they likely don't want to have it locked in for an entire extra year at that, and it's more so reserved for a player whose contract will be expiring at the end of this season, it's going to be very difficult for Granlund to be moved unless the Sharks pull off some crazy like three-way type of trade. And so without that motivation, perhaps it is possible that Granlund's game has slightly fallen off. I won't necessarily say that that's the case, that is pure speculation, but maybe that is something there to be said. When it comes to the second line, we have Zadina, Eklund, and Cunnin. I want to focus a bit here on William Eklund, who again, from an offensive standpoint, I actually did think had a pretty good game. Obviously not quite at the levels of either Duclair or Zetterlund or really anybody on that first line, but I thought he did some very good things offensively. However, at the moment, it does feel as though the current experiment that has been more so forced by David Quinn to have to do just due to multiple injuries to both Tomas Hertl and Logan Couture, but currently the experiment of Eklund being that center ice position isn't really working out all that well. I find that defensively, Eklund having to play deeper in his own defensive zone just due to being the center on this line really hasn't been working out. When he's actually playing defensively as a winger, he plays much higher in the zone, is able to pressure the point, is able to use his stick more to interrupt those passing lanes. I think he excels more so at that, but when he's playing as a center, he's deeper in the zone, he's fighting in front of the net, he's not necessarily the strongest player, and so he doesn't really have that same type of advantage, which does hamper his game for sure, and it is a big reason for why defensively he has struggled in many of the past few games that he has played. So I know Hertl and Couture, is very possible neither of them actually play any more games for the rest of this season. Perhaps they'll be back for like the last week or two, depending on how things go down. And so Eklund may still be forced to play center for much of the rest of this year. But at the moment, unless he sort of grows into it and maybe gets more experience there, it's just not really working out super well. When it comes to his two other wingers here, Luke Kunin, I barely even noticed him tonight, not in the slick, under-the-radar style of way where I thought he still played pretty well. Nope, not anything like that. Kunin barely even caught my eye on the night, so not great for him. When it comes to Zadina, definitely at least a couple of steps above Luke Kunin. Noticeable player, did score, which was quite nice to see, and an okay compliment for William Eklund as well, but maybe not his best game that he has had as of late. When it comes to the third line, we had Barabanov actually returning to the lineup, so the Sharks move away from the 11 forward, 7 defensemen, if you could really call it that, considering Addison was playing in a forward position, and so they go back to the more classical 12-6 formation with Barabanov jumping into the lineup, and because of this, it is LeBanc getting subbed out. I'll talk about that a bit later, but currently Barabanov, Sturm, and Bailey paired together. I will say Bailey I thought was probably the best player up, maybe close with Nico Sturm. I liked Bailey's game here tonight, made a couple of really slick plays in the offensive zone to keep pucks alive near the blue line, made a couple of okay passes as well. Nothing outstanding, but pretty solid as a third liner. Nico Sturm, I would say the same thing. Very nice pass, honestly, on the Ryan Carpenter goal that made it 3-2 San Jose in the second period, so that was great to see. But Barabanov was just kind of like Luke Kunin, entirely invisible here tonight. Felt as though he only touched the puck like less than half a dozen times here tonight and just didn't really make much of an impact. So while Anthony Duclair's stock massively rose here tonight in terms of the few days in front of the trade deadline, Barabanov's just continued to absolutely fall, and at this point it's impossible to imagine that he would actually end up getting moved if it wasn't for like a 7th round pick, and even that is kind of hard to imagine. When it comes to the fourth line, we did have Smith, Carpenter, and Hoffman. Like I mentioned, no Kevin LeBanc here in the lineup. I talked about how in the previous game that second line opportunity felt as though it was like a last chance for LeBanc, and the fact that it didn't actually end up working out, it's not that much of a surprise to see him move out of the lineup at this point. When it comes to the rest of this fourth line, credit, of course, goes to Ryan Carpenter for having scored that goal. Mike Hoffman also had a very nice pass on the Filip Zadina goal, but the odd man out continues to be Giovanni Smith, who just hasn't really managed to find a home on the bottom line for the San Jose Sharks. The fourth line have actually had relatively decent success over the last couple of months, usually putting up some decent games for San Jose, whether that's a combination of like Carpenter, Bailey, and whoever might find themselves in that role. Smith just hasn't really been contributing in that. He had like 1 or 2 decent shifts here tonight. That much should be said. But if you take a look at the first goal, the one that really started the snowball for the Dallas Stars, which is the one in the third period scored there by Stankoven that made it 6-4 for San Jose at that point, it is Giovanni Smith who gets neutralized near the center line where you can easily just dump it in, avoid the icing, get a line change, and especially as a fourth line forward near the end of your shift, this is exactly what you should be hoping to do, but he ends up giving the puck away, catches the Sharks defense changing, and ends up in a goal to the back of the net, so not very good there for Smith. That's the type of play that you would get benched in a lot of situations, especially if you were a younger player, and I wonder if that will indeed happen to Smith, because it definitely did not reflect well on him. When it comes defensively, we again have the top pairing of Ferraro and Vlasic. Now, Vlasic's game hasn't impressed me much over these last couple of games, but I also haven't been disappointed. Here tonight, it is a slight change, as I thought Vlasic's game saw a small drop in terms of performance. Not exactly letting up tons of great chances, but I disliked how much zone time, especially in the first period, even if these shots were coming from the perimeter, of how much zone time was given up. I was hoping Vlasic could make slightly stronger plays. He also had a pretty bad one on one of the goals there in the third period that was on the way for the Dallas Stars to make their comeback in this game, so not great for him. Ferraro, honestly, leading up to the deadline, his name has been tossed around a bit in trade rumors, whether or not he will be moved or he will not be moved. I would say his game was more so akin to Barabanov tonight compared to Declare, as I don't think Ferraro was all that great here. When it comes to the next pairing, we have Thrun and Ruda. Thrun had an extremely hit-or-miss game. There were a few plays here tonight where he looked really, really good, making some slick passes right out of the defensive zone, but also making some strong offensive plays, keeping pucks in at the blue line. And then other times it felt as though he was either holding on to the puck a bit too long or not holding on to the puck long enough. There was a play on a 4-on-4 situation, I believe it was in the second period if I'm not remembering incorrectly, where Thrun holds the puck for a good 10-15 seconds trying to find some sort of opening in the offensive zone, and he ends up just losing this puck, and so some strong offensive zone time and pressure for San Jose just ends on the stick of Henry Thrun, which you never really want to see happen. So he held the puck for just a bit too long there, but other times making a couple of giveaways. I will say generally a positive game for Thrun, as he ended up being one of the better defensemen, more so just considering the fact that a couple of the other defensemen here were not very good, but still not at a super high level either. And then when it comes to the third defensive pairing, surprisingly, we saw Calen Addison get put back here. I thought he was doing a half decent job in the forward position that they had put him in over these last couple of games, and I even talked about how the good news of him being in that position is that he doesn't have to play defense all that much. Well, I guess because Okhotiuk was not good in the previous outing against the Minnesota Wild, we see Addison get back into an actual defensive role. He did have a very nice pass, I'll give him that, to Mike Hoffman on the fourth goal scored by the San Jose Sharks, the Zadina goal. But besides that, defensively, it's again just lost battles, more of the same thing. There really isn't much else to say there. Where we really get to a major issue for the Sharks here tonight, and recently for the Sharks as well, is the goaltender Kaapo Kähkönen, who just continues to really be falling off a cliff for San Jose, reverting back to the Kaapo Kähkönen that the Sharks were seeing very often last season, where he was one of the worst goaltenders to have played an actual game at all in the NHL. So this season he's been so much better, but over these last couple of weeks, that has not actually been the case. I made the joke that perhaps he's trying to play himself out of a trade so that he remains in San Jose, and he currently is very much doing that. His value has absolutely tanked over these last few games. Him letting in 7 goals, and multiple of them not being very good. In the Dallas Stars comeback, the 3 goals they scored in the third period, the third one, I would say, didn't have much of a chance on, but the first 2, the ones that made it 6-4 and 6-5 and really put the Sharks on their heels in that one, those were 2 goals that Kähkönen absolutely should have been able to make the save on, but it just didn't exist. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they will be taking on the New York Islanders one day before the trade deadline, so that is the last possible moment to make an impact. But who knows, maybe the Sharks will have even made multiple trades by then. Class dismissed.